one more time. You apologize, right?
I apologize.
You're deluded. Yes. Okay.
Yes, I'm deluded.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we don't see
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Zero Squared is the Zero Books podcast. I'm imagining what the thumbnail is going to look like, and I'm thinking it will be a sad-looking Pepe, frog, and the title will be Trump supporter finally apologizes. But then the title underneath will be something like "Losing a Bet, the Apology," or something like that. So to make it clear that it's not like you're not apologizing for everything, but a particular thing. So let's start there, though. We had made a bet a while back that if Biden became president, you would lose, and if Trump became president or remained president, I would lose. Right? That was the fundamental of the bet.
Fundamentally, yeah. I mean, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, and I do want to. I find that the presidency is a lot like anything else, where possession is 9/10 of the law, and he overwhelmingly seems like he's president. I can maybe make arguments like he's not really in charge, and I kind of want to make this to an extension. So what I'm calling this is like a provisional apology, because I'm admitting that there probably isn't a remedy that's going to get him back in. Chances are either he lost, or even if he won, there's not going to be a way to get him out, nullify the results, as opposed to just impeaching him out or something. So
well, just to be clear, the original bet was whether or not Biden would be inaugurated or whether Trump would hold on to power. And there are a variety of ways in which he might have held on to power that you thought were in the mix.
And I still think that, but I'm apologizing anyway. And what we talked about was having the provision that if it turns out I'm right, which I don't think it's over, but at this point, the fat lady sung enough that I'm willing to apologize. But okay. I still want you to agree that if for some reason he's put back in power, or even if I'd even like to request that if it comes out that the election was rigged, that you would still owe me an apology then.
Well, okay.
Would you agree to that?
I've never said that the election wasn't rigged. That's not what I've ever said. I said that there's no good evidence now that the election was rigged. And this is what we need to talk about in the rest of this discussion, at least a little bit, because I hold on to the right to change my opinion as evidence changes.
Okay.
As new evidence comes in. So if it comes out that there's really good evidence that the election was rigged, and that leads, especially if that leads to a change in power, but even if it doesn't, I will gladly concede that the election was rigged. So to give you an example of what I mean, in 2000, there was a very close election. It looked as though Bush had won in Florida. But after Bush was in office, a bunch of media companies actually did the recount that the Supreme Court had blocked from being done. And it turned out that if you counted all the ballots, that in fact Gore won by a few hundred votes and not Bush. However, what also was the case is if you only counted the ballots that Gore was requesting be recounted, then Bush would have still won. And Gore was cherry picking which districts he wanted recounting to take place in, so that to give himself a better chance, it looked like. And that was a miscalculation on his part. The judge who ordered the recount said he was going to order a recount for every vote. So it probably, if that had gone through, Gore would have won. So if that kind of evidence comes forward, where there's an evaluation of the votes in enough states where it would show that Trump actually won, I would concede that had happened, but I wouldn't apologize because I've never claimed that I know for an absolute fact what's happened. I just would say I know that the evidence I've seen.
Well, I think you kind of owe me an apology for making me apologize unnecessarily, wouldn't you think?
No, because the bet wasn't about whether or not the vote was rigged. The bet was about who will be inaugurated, whether or not Trump will maintain power, who will end up being president. It wasn't about.
But then you have all the little details about what exactly, how do you define power? I mean, clearly, and some of this, what we even handled in advance, because you were not going to get trapped by the idea that Biden was actually competent. I mean, you knew that going into it. Right.
So
now we have this idea that, you know, I would think if he got kicked out in the first 100 days, given the 25th Amendment, that you could argue he never really was legitimately in power. So we even talked about that a little bit off.
Well, okay.
DM where
if Biden gets kicked out within the first 100 days and Kamala Harris becomes president, I don't think that proves your case.
Yes, exactly. Because he is successfully transferring power. So the idea is there's some way that this can be undone, almost like the difference between a divorce and an annulment. If it's not undone, if it's not established that it was never credible in the first place, then you'd still win. But if for some reason it's overturned, then
like, you know, like the election, if somehow someone comes in and says, okay, here's how the vote was rigged. Here are the votes that weren't counted, or the votes that were counted that shouldn't have been. They've done, and they put that evidence forward, and I can look at it, and it's valid evidence. It's real evidence, not just an assertion. Then I would say that you still would have lost the original bet, but I will make a new bet right now.
Okay.
That I will apologize if that happens, because I'm convinced that won't happen.
All right.
But
and you're probably right there, right?
Yeah. But look, but I don't. You don't even need to apologize if it doesn't happen, because forget it. But I will apologize. Like, we don't have to. You don't have to lose anything in this bet, because I'm so confident that it's not going to happen. I'll just bet you, just on my own. You know, like, I'll apologize, and if it doesn't happen, you know, nothing. There's no consequences for you.
I can apologize. No big deal. I mean,
yeah, but how many apologies do I want? I don't really want a second apology from you, because after a while, it'll just be, we could just keep betting on all sorts of things, and I could have you come on every week and apologize. That's not going to be that entertaining for people. This is a big one, Stephen. This is a big apology. This is the only one. And so the original terms was, if I lost, I would apologize and say I didn't have a good grip of reality and I was misunderstanding the facts. And you agreed that you would do the same. So would you say that that's the case?
I sincerely apologize for inflicting my maladapted point of views on you and your audience.
Oh, no. That's not. That's not what you didn't inflict anything. You just didn't have a good grip of the facts. Okay. All right. So,
thank you.
Yeah. So here's the thing. Let's talk a little bit about confirmation bias, because I feel as though I don't experience it when I have that confirmation bias. You know, I probably miss it a good portion of the time, but I can see it in other people more easily, you know?
Oh, absolutely.
And lately I've seen it a lot online on liberal and left, in the liberal left online circles around the shooting in Atlanta. This would be the example I would give for liberal bias. Confirmation bias.
So when you say liberal, you mean left, right? When you say liberal, you mean left?
I mean liberal as in the way it's been redefined since, let's say, FDR, where liberal meaning Democratic Party liberal. And left, I would say, shouldn't be the same thing, but happens to often be. But anyhow, people were very quick to decide that the shooter in Atlanta was racially motivated, despite the evidence being, at very least, complicating that story and probably largely discrediting that story.
I think the Colorado shooting might be even better, where they jumped to the conclusion because they thought it was a white guy. And then as soon as they found it out, it wasn't. Oh, well, let's not worry about that.
Well, yesterday I almost posted that the Boulder shooting was just yet another confirmation of white supremacy in America. And the reason I almost did that was because I wanted to make the point that no one knew who the shooter was yet. And so it would be ridiculous for me to say such a thing. And I was trying to I was going to be making a mockery of all the people who had decided what the meaning of the Atlanta shooting was before all the evidence was in. But then today I find out that a lot of people actually did what I was going to do in jest, seriously. And before the information came in, decide they knew who the shooter was. I still don't know what happened in Boulder or why, what the motive was with the shooter.
I don't know a lot about either one of those stories, actually. So,
yeah, but in Atlanta, it looks like the guy who did the shooting was trying to kill the women who he found tempting sexually, and because he was very religious and found himself addicted to going to massage parlors or using porn, and so his plan was apparently to kill the people at the massage parlors and then go to a porn studio and kill everyone there. Obviously not clearly an unhinged person. I think it's fair to say it was misogyny that was behind it, the kind of misogyny. But I mean, truly, but it's not clear. It could be, but it's not clear that it was anti-Asian sentiment that compelled him. But a lot of people were convinced that it was, and when given evidence that it might not be, discounted the evidence based on the source. Oh, well, the cops say that. Well, they're in league with him. The cops say that they're just as racist as he is. And I just don't think that makes that kind of confirmation bias where when you see evidence, you dismiss the evidence based on what you assume to be the character of the person presenting the evidence is a bad move. And I would say you've done similar things when I've said, look, for instance, here's this security cam footage, which shows that the votes that Giuliani said were fake votes and hidden in suitcases were actually certified votes that had been placed under the table a few hours before in front of poll watchers. And I point out that security footage exists, and you're like, well, why do you believe the mainstream media? They're dead set against Trump. They report the truth.
It was a piece on the news, the mainstream media, where they explained that. So basically, we're looking at the same footage, and we have two different narratives on the footage. You have the left.
Well, we're looking at, and Giuliani showed one clip, right? And the media that reported on it later showed more than one clip. They showed two clips.
But then there have been documentaries and stuff that showed more of the footage. I shared one on your wall. But
that footage didn't. In the documentary, there was what was shown was to me wasn't very clear that someone who was supposedly a poll worker, counting the votes, talking to the camera, and then some social media posts that couldn't be verified. That with the Atlanta shooting, there was also a Facebook post where the guy apparently confessed to being racially motivated, but those had been doctored. Those were being released by media companies. I think it was a Chinese media company, and it was demonstrated to be false. It was a doctored screenshot. So I tend to discount screenshots from social media that haven't been verified.
Well, the thing is that I haven't argued that the election was flipped. I'm just arguing that we need more investigation. So I've never, from a confirmation bias standpoint, I can't be leveled with that charge because I'm not arguing that it was flipped. Admittedly, I believe I really think it was, but being a man of a rational thinker, I would not make that conclusion until I saw evidence. And it shouldn't be that hard to get evidence. It's alleged that, for example, they ran those ballots through more than once. Now, it ought to be easy to scan those and easy to look at forensic data.
And Where did they do that? In Georgia or somewhere else?
It might have been somewhere else. I'd have to look at the video. But the surveillance tape in Georgia, the one in question, according to the counter narrative, the right side narrative, they did run it through more than once. So, starters, if it's even possible to run those through more than once, that's game over. I mean, you can't have a voting system where you could have poll workers that are even where it's even possible. And the other thing you got wrong was that there is a vote tally. There's a computer tally, and it does show that all the votes that went through during that period of time were for Biden. That's almost impossible to have happen.
You know, I'm going to say that I'm very, very skeptical of the claim that all the votes that went in that period of time when they were counting the votes, when the poll watchers were missing, were for Biden. And I think that to prove that would be very, very difficult. And the other thing I'll say is that in Georgia, there was a hand recount after that. So if there were double counting or there was some sort of fake vote, some fake votes were put in, those would have been caught in the hand recount.
Well, you're assuming they would have, and that's assuming that the people involved in the recount were involved in the fake part in the first place.
Well,
so
at that point,
this is about forensic audits with independent sources,
independent of the Georgia Republican state government.
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
and just in general elections, you would have the protocols involved to make sure there are watchers. And I mean, we can tell from that video, they even admitted in the narrative, the left narrative, that there weren't. And we just act like, look, that's a big problem.
No one's disputing the fact that the poll watchers left at a particular point in time. And then after they left, a call came in saying, start counting again. And so that was obviously a mistake. That was wrong. But the thing about that to remember, though, again, is that there was a recount afterwards, and also the votes that were counted had been certified in front of the poll watchers. So there's nothing suspicious about the votes that were counted. There's nothing suspicious about the recount that anyone has pointed to. There is something. There's a problem with the poll watchers not being there, but I wouldn't want it to be the case that all those people whose votes were counted in that moment were disenfranchised because
absolutely. But that's a different argument. That is a different argument. I mean, you could argue that if they changed the rules, which we know they did, and let's say they said, okay,
we're talking about the rules about mail-in voting at this point,
right? So let's say let's just I'm not sure of the particulars here, but let's just say they extend the date in the rules that the court and the executive branch did this without the legislative branch, which has to be involved to make that constitutionally legal. So let's say they extend the date, and a person says, "Okay, now I have an extra day to vote," and they don't vote within the time frame. Certainly, we wouldn't want that vote not to count just because that person. So now we create this problem, and it's probably a good idea to define remedy. When there's a issue like that, legally there's got to be a remedy. So if someone voted, and then the Supreme Court goes back and says, okay, well, that vote now is illegitimate because that rule change can't allow that to be, that person then was stripped of his vote. So that's a huge problem. And there's a lot of ways where we can argue if we're both going to say, okay, we're going to reserve our conclusions until we have evidence either way. Let's say you and I are both there. We could get to the point where we may never know that because you start digging around if we could get God to check the votes, and let's say someone screwed up the zip code on their vote, so now their vote doesn't count. Certainly if God was counting it, he could say, okay, yeah, I know what he meant. That one goes. But then if someone tried to do two votes, God say, no, I'm going to catch that one.
Right.
So how do we ever really get to the truth? We may never.
In the case of the change in the rules to make voting by mail easier, and I think and again in Georgia,
it also makes cheating easier, though. Unfortunately.
Well,
That's the whole point.
I mean, well, maybe it does. I'm not sure about that, but
I think
what
it's been made. The case has been made by the Democrats in other elections where the shoe was on the other foot.
well, there are instances where voting by mail and they've been caught out cheating in small
Sure.
elections, and I saw that. But the remedy has been to do signature verification, and I think, and also just to recount the votes. I mean, when there's cheating, my understanding is that double counting might be part of it, or fake votes are put through. And a hand recount would catch that, I would think. But the main thing is recounting is the remedy for when there's discrepancies in the initial count. And even when it's just the discrepancy is it's so close statistically, you can't be sure that errors that always are a possibility haven't tipped the vote one way or another. That when it's really close, you want to do a recount to verify your initial count.
But recount's not good enough. The bottom line is this is not you're innocent until proven guilty. They have the responsibility to prove to us that the election was sound. And there are rules in place to do that. There are rules that say you have to keep votes for a certain thing. There are rules that say you can't modify the machines within a certain point. You have to keep ballots available for 90 days so they can be checked. And it would be easy, like those votes allegedly that all went for Biden. Those votes, when you scan those votes, or when those votes are printed, and they're printed when they're scanned. I remember when I voted, it produced the ballot I gave to someone, they scanned it. For example, you could scan out all the votes that were in question, but that's not going to happen in a regular recount. And if you listen to some of the Robert Barnes, who's an expert on this, on the Viva Frei, he gets to that quite a bit, to where this is not happening. You have a lot of cases that are getting thrown out. We talked about how did I know? And I'm not going to be able to get back to it, but you questioned. But there are things that would come out in court cases. There are things that would come out in forensic audits where they're actually scanning ballots that wouldn't necessarily come out in a recount. And especially if the same people who know how they cheated are doing the recount, it's arguably they would know how to work around the recount to make it seem like everything was fair. But what is clear is protocol was not followed, and that's unacceptable. That is a reason to be suspicious. And according to what I hear, the kind of remedies are not in place to make sure things beyond just a simple recount, forensic audits, certainly court cases where they're looking experts, doing paper samples. I heard there were fake ballots from China. That may not come out in just a simple recount. And arguably, it was never, that level was never done.
Okay.
And the bottom line, okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, let me the last thing you said, you heard there were fake ballots from China. Okay. That does, I'm going to just dismiss that out of hand because there's no way for me to verify that. I don't know where there were fake ballots from China. I don't know how they would have gotten into the system.
Yeah, but come on,
okay.
You can't do that.
No, wait.
You can't
hold on,
validate it just because you didn't hear about it.
No, right. Okay, well,
it could be. I'm not saying it's true. I'm not concluding it's true.
Stephen, let me get to the point. Let me get to my point. Here's my point. When you're talking about the rules and the remedies that exist in the legal system, you're actually entering into terrain that I'm not an expert in, and that you're not an expert in, and that in order to really get to the bottom of it, you'd have to, I think, spend at least a couple of days reading up on the laws in different parts of the country, because they're different in different parts of the country. And you'd have to examine, what the court decision was, what was argued in the courts, and to see whether or not the court decisions were adequate. My stance is the same stance I had with the Atlanta shooting. Since I'm not in a position to make those kinds of judgments clearly, and we do have these institutions which are designed to make these kinds of decisions where the laws are known and argued by people who are paid and are experts in that, I tend to trust the court decisions over my own judgments based on things I hear on social media. The same thing's true with in Atlanta. The cops are there. They're trained to investigate crimes. They have experience interrogating suspects, and I trust their reports until I have been given really good evidence not to. Now, what I've never encountered is solid evidence that the rules that were broken would require, because there was a rule, the poll watcher rule, that was violated, but the remedy for that, I don't know what the legal remedy would have been. I've looked into it a little bit, and most of the poll watcher rules that I see are actually really aimed at keeping poll watchers from harassing and discouraging voters.
Yes.
Okay, so that's one of the primary concerns about poll watchers. As far as what poll watcher, with the poll watchers, and there's like rules that are in place so that the officials at the polls have the right to eject poll watchers if they violate the rules of their behavior and conduct, right? So it seems to me that and it was only recently that poll watchers were allowed back in because there was such concern about racial discrimination and suppressing the vote, that poll watchers weren't allowed for many years, and it's only been recently that's been changed. So my thought here is that the remedy for when a poll watcher is sent home accidentally is not to throw out all the votes that were counted when they weren't there, but to examine, but I would think that the very most you would do, and it may not even be actually a real remedy, because the reason they did the recount was not this, but I think the most you would do is recount the vote. Now, if you're talking about the changes in the rules around mail-in ballots, which is not the same thing as the question of poll watchers,
yes,
right? So there were court cases that were put forward before the election where the Republicans were trying to make it more difficult to vote by mail, and the reason why is because it was thought Democrats were more likely to vote by mail. And there were court cases and attempts to change the outcome or throw out votes or have a based on the change of the rules after the case. And in both times, the courts ruled against the Republicans or against the Trump
they
administration.
didn't. No. They did not hear the case. These cases have not been heard.
They didn't have enough
That's
standing
different.
for even to get to hear the
But
case.
that's different. That they didn't look at the evidence. They are just saying you don't have standing. To conclude that they looked at the evidence and there was no evidence because the court.
Well, no, the rules were changed. You didn't need to prove that in the case of the rule change.
Okay, in case the rule change. I'm talking about.
This is what we're talking about. Yeah, no, I'm talking about the rule change. So the courts refused to hear the case because they didn't find that the rule change was in violation of the law, or that there was standing to show that the Republicans had been wronged, or the rights had been trod upon, or anything like that by the rule change.
You got to be very careful there, because
I know,
it is very clear, according to Barnes, and he's the kind of the expert that I've taken a lot of time to. These cases are being dismissed because of procedure, not because there wasn't enough evidence. And there's a lot of conclusions being made on the left that this is the case, that, they didn't take the courts.
We're talking about a procedural issue all the way around. How long will they?
No, we're not. It's
when
not
it comes
a
to the
procedure.
rule changes, we are. Because what we're talking about is.
No, I'm talking about procedures in court.
Whether or not the votes are postmarked on a certain date, and how long after the election day they will still count votes that come in with a certain postmark.
Yeah, that's procedural for the vote, not procedural for the court case. When you
but that's a procedural. It's a question of whether or not that change in procedure was within the bounds of the law, or whether or not the Republicans had rights have been violated by that rule change. And
that's an open question.
They're saying, look, there's a procedure of how this legislation or rules should be changed that you didn't follow, which is another procedural objection. None of it has to do with those votes being faulty or fake or anything like that.
Yeah, but that's the thing. The whole reason that they would try to do that, and that's been acknowledged on both sides of the aisle, is because it loosens up and makes it easier to cheat. And it's very important to notice that those questions were not reviewed in court.
That's not true. The pandemic, the primary reason, the stated justification for making it easier to vote by mail is because it was harder to vote in person because of the pandemic. So you wanted to make it easier for people to vote by mail and loosen the rules around postmarks so that if you vote the day of the election and it's postmarked that day, your vote still counts, even though it is received 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 days later through the mail system.
So you're going to say there's no way it's harder to cheat, or it's not easier to cheat if they by vote by mail than regular. Is that what you're maintaining?
Whether or not it's easier to cheat by vote by mail or not is not the same thing as saying the reason they wanted to make it easier for people to vote by mail was because of the desire to cheat. I mean, they wanted to make it easier so that people could vote during a pandemic. That was the reason. And the other thing is, I live in a state where we've only got vote by mail.
Well, so that's a different thing too. I mean, if you have certain states that have had vote by mail rules for a long time and they're used to it, that's different than changing it the week before to someone who doesn't.
Well, I think they changed it well before, not just a week before, but I do think, but they changed it a few months before, and to loosen it up because of the pandemic, and the Republicans objected because they thought it would make, for 2 reasons, because of the possible, they said it would make it easier to cheat, but also because the left would say they didn't want to make it easier for Democrats to vote, and they knew that the easier you made it for the Democrats to vote, the harder it would be for them to win the election. I don't know whether or not the rule changes were procedurally justified or not, but I do know that the courts didn't think that the way those changes in the rules happened were severe enough or enough of a violation to warrant even hearing a case about changing the vote.
That is not what Barnes says. Barnes maintains that these are open questions, that these cases have been dismissed because of standing and other court procedural. They call it, we're getting the procedure of the case confused with the procedure in the vote. Barnes is maintaining that these are open questions, that the courts did not dismiss these cases because they saw evidence and said, oh, there's not enough evidence. They did not look at the evidence.
No,
so these questions
they said that the Republicans didn't have standing. What does it mean to say that you don't have standing?
Well, according to Barnes, standing means that it's an excuse for a court to get out of here in a case. You'd have to kind of sift through the Viva Frei videos, but he said that. He said it's a joke, that they use this to dodge their responsibility in finding these cases. And
my understanding of standing is, like, if I hear that I'm going to give an example that may not even be right, but let's say that I hear that my neighbor has stolen money from another neighbor.
Right.
And I want to charge him with a crime, and I accuse him of the crime and try to take him to court. I wouldn't have standing because I wasn't the person who was robbed. I couldn't.
Well, according to Barnes, like in the case of the Texas lawsuit against would be Texas against Pennsylvania. The idea that a state doesn't have standing is ridiculous. That's right out of Barnes's mouth. I mean, the court is designed. I mean, that's one of the primary things about the court is to hear cases between when states disagree, arbitrate. And Barnes said it's absolutely a travesty that the Supreme Court, and we could talk about just the fact that 70 million people don't believe in the results, and it's the Supreme Court's job, it's the legislature's job, it's all these people's job. Again, they have the onus on them to prove that this was a good election. You have an election where 70 million people don't believe the results. They, by definition, have failed on those things. And the ways that we would increase confidence in the election is to have the court cases, look at the evidence, do the forensic audits. And these things are not being done. It's not.
Well, I
They're
mean,
just moving on. They're just moving on.
the fact is that each state has its own, and I think it could come down to district and county even, has different rules for how votes are done and how the votes are counted. And so I think the court, my guess is that the courts would be reluctant to give another state standing and allow them to sue because they didn't like the results that were achieved because of the rules that another state had. So anytime, so if you say, okay, Texas has standing over Georgia's vote results and the changes in rules in Georgia, then anytime there's an election and one state doesn't like the results, they can sue based on the difference in the rules between one state and another.
That's not true.
Well, what were they suing about?
They were suing about changes made at the state level without the state legislature, which constitutionally is required to change the rules. So they're not following their own rules. And there is some aspect of the fact, we talked about federal standards. You know, the way this would work is the states or whatever, counties, they have their rules. And presumably they are approved that these are sound rules. And if these rules are followed, we will get a sound vote.
Okay.
But then if you don't follow those rules, that's a big problem.
Well, my understanding is that the state's legislature is the only body that that has the power to change or set their own rules for vote counting, right?
Exactly. Under the Constitution, that's the state legislature's baby.
Right. So, but whether or
So
not
it was changed in these other states.
On what level that must occur, like if like, you know, does that mean that only the legislature can decide how many people are hired to count the vote in a different county? Or does that mean that only the state legislature can decide when a postmark must be on an envelope? Or is it possible for counties to make some of these decisions? Can the legislature decide we then empower our counties and our districts to make certain kinds of rule changes on their own? Or are they required by the federal law to oversee every aspect of counting the vote?
Well, that's where the judge comes in, because and that's why it's so devastating that these cases are not being heard.
Right. I mean, I think that I mean the other, just to flip it around one more time, if you say that only the state legislators have the right to change the rules of the vote, and some other state wants to step in and say, hey, you didn't you didn't take responsibility for changing these rules, therefore, you know, you delegated this to other parts of your state, to other authorities in the state, and you're not allowed to. Therefore,
careful, not delegated. These people did that on their own.
Were the state legislatures objecting to the rule change?
You know, again, I heard that they did, and I've even heard that they were intimidated at first, capitulated, and then at the time around when they were certifying the votes, there were state legislatures that were trying to recall which is why Mike Pence just stepped in and stopped that the certification of the vote.
Okay, so
we have checks
that this rule change is the only bit of evidence that there really is that's substantiated out there that did happen, and no one would dispute that this was something that was being litigated before the election and was being litigated after the election. But now, so now you have something maybe like the Supreme Court decision in 2000, right?
Yeah.
And so you have something like the Supreme Court decision in 2000. And if you had asked me in 2001 whether I thought George Bush was legitimately president, I would have pointed to that Supreme Court decision, and I would have said, no, look, this Supreme Court decision was ridiculous. They were using they themselves in the writing it when they wrote it up, saying that the vote recount had to be stopped because it violated the rights of the voters, because there are different standards being applied to different counties. They themselves said this decision should not have any bearing on future cases. Like this is a one-time decision. So the problem that was going to occur during the recount had also occurred during the original count. It was just a clearly ridiculous decision. So the responsibility for people who want to prove to rational people that this change in the rules around mail-in ballots was unacceptable, I think would have to meet the same standard of that Supreme Court decision. What I would want is for Barnes or someone like him to write a book or write at least a really strong essay, an in-depth essay that explained all the legal consequences and of the decision not to hear these other states, and also explained why there was a substantial objection to the rule changes to begin with.
I'd argue he has. I mean, if you listen to these Viva Frei, hours and hours of where they're going on, and I feel pretty satisfied that he's provided exactly that.
Well, the other thing you would need is to show that if you actually went through, and this is something that the right-wing media could do, just like the left-wing media did it in 2000. You have to show, okay, if you actually throw out the ballots that came in, and may be difficult, but that came in with postmarks, but that came in after the date of the election, then it would change the result. Then, and that basically the ballots that were allowed to be counted because of the rule change, if you throw those out, then the results of the election are changed. That would be the other thing I'd need to know, right? So I need to know that the rule change itself was illegitimate, just in the same way the Supreme Court decision in 2000 was illegitimate, and I'd need to know that it was consequential. And I don't know either of those things as an absolute fact. It seems to me that the rule change question is more ambiguous than what happened in 2000. And I don't feel like I have the legal expertise to really render a solid judgment on it. But I'm willing to look into it. And I'll tell you what I'll do, actually. I'll look into it. I'll read Barnes. I'll look at what Barnes has said. I'll try to figure out what the law actually is. And I'll put an addendum to this interview with my conclusions. And then I'll send them to you. And you can tell me in writing what you think of my conclusions. And then I'll read that as well. But just to go back to confirmation bias, this is one of those moments in history, just like in 2000, where it's very easy to be absolutely sure. And I think in 2000, the case was pretty strong, but I did have a confirmation bias. I mean, I hated George Bush. I and after 9/11 and we went to war in Iraq, I really hated George Bush. I think that it's difficult to, let go of your partisanship and look at these legal questions, with objective eyes. And that's what I would ask that we both try to do.
Well, I'd like to bring up the problem of the false narratives popping out, and then
the false narratives around like Trump's calls and the Russiagate thing, and the way the media has its own confirmation bias that's very clear, right? That's what you're talking about.
It's very easy. I mean, if someone's jumping out prematurely and giving false stories, I mean, it's very easy for someone with very little confirmation bias to be buying into these stories. I mean, let's go back to the Capitol insurrection.
Yeah,
it's a huge piece of the puzzle that Sicknick was not. They do not have any evidence that Sicknick was killed directly by Trump supporters.
That's the cop that supposedly had been hit over the head with a fire extinguisher, but who hadn't been.
Right.
And
so they had to retract the story out of the New York Times, huh?
He may have had a stroke or
he
something.
Had a stroke or something. So
yeah.
So what that means is you have a president that was impeached on the idea, and the reason that this was so serious, this insurrection, was the loss of life. And they're assuming when they ran this case that Trump supporters were driven to kill this man with a fire extinguisher. That was the narrative.
Was that stated during the impeachment proceedings?
Well,
Because the
I'm
truth
not
is,
sure. I'm not sure it was, but it's implicit. I mean, the whole reason it had teeth was because of the loss of life. You take away the fact that now they cannot prove that any Trump supporter directly killed anybody, and also throw in the fact all the shenanigans, the idea that there were Antifa or Black Lives Matter there, maybe that there was planning, pre-planning, there was issues. Nancy Pelosi was in charge of security. How did this all happen?
Here's the thing about impeachment is that it's not a legal proceeding.
Exactly.
And the facts don't matter. It is an exercise of political power.
Exactly.
Okay?
That's true. But
yeah,
but it speaks to how ridiculous that is. That they ran this through in 6 hours with no evidence. These are the kind of things that should have come out in evidence. You know, it may not be a legal procedure, but there's still due process in this country.
Well, he wasn't convicted, right? I mean,
well, he couldn't have been convicted because the Senate would need a case. They didn't present any evidence, so they had no intent. There was no way they could have.
Yeah,
there was no case. They didn't present any evidence.
I think the impeachment the second time, and probably both times, but certainly the second time, was not only if you argued it on legal grounds alone, I don't think any of it would have held up. I don't think you could have demonstrated that Trump's speech caused the insurrection. I think he was irresponsible. Okay, I think he was a poor politician.
We talked about the hazard of.
I would never vote for Trump ever, but I don't think that he could be found guilty of incitement. I just don't think that's the case. Now I might be wrong. I'd be glad to hear anyone who wants to argue against that position, but I don't think that what he said in the speeches or beforehand counts as the kind of speech that constitutes incitement. And okay, so there's that.
So if I'm reading you right, you're kind of allowing for that, which gets us back to confirmation bias, where the media is jumping into these narratives. You know, Trump was killing people by inciting a riot. That wasn't true.
Yeah, I mean, look,
the Mueller Obamagate, the same thing. It wasn't true.
We don't have an objective media now. We have partisan media. We have
so
Fox News and CNN, and we don't have anyone whose job is to step back and go, okay, can we be objective? It used to be back 20 years ago, back in, when Bush versus Gore happened. I can't believe how long ago that was. But when that happened, I think we had something a little closer to objective media then. I think CNN had a different character. I think Newsweek and Time had a different character. Mm-hmm. But for a variety of material reasons, everything is siloed out into demographics and partisanship. And it takes a Marxist to try to step in and be objective. Right? But I'm kidding. So if you're going to argue whether or not the impeachment was justified, I'm not going to argue with you about that. I don't think that impeachment was either wise politically nor justified on legal grounds. But it doesn't have to be either thing to be fully constitutional.
The problem is you have people out there that have no idea that the press is lying to them. And much of the hatred for Trump is unjustified. Because
you're being lied to.
TV, and they're saying,
you're being lied to by Fox, right? You know that when you watch Fox News.
Absolutely.
Okay, so look, most even rad lib Democrats know that they're being lied to. They just like it. They enjoy that more than being lied to by the other side. They don't trust it.
But there's a lot of people. I have people I know that you can't even talk to them about this. They're sure that the media is telling them the truth. They sit in front of their TV and believe what they're being told.
Are they watching CNN or MSNBC or Fox?
I'm not sure. They'd probably be the left because they're on the left.
Okay, yeah. Well, I just,
But that's where we're at with the election. That's why I think the election could get flipped. I mean, I think it's possible to not fall for the problem of accepting a conclusion without evidence. I will allow that it's still possible that Biden actually won the election. And I don't believe that, but I would reserve final judgment until the evidence proved one way or the other. It's also possible that they did steal the election, but there's no way that they're ever going to there's no remedy that would get Trump
Well,
back. So we're
now,
kind of back to
just to be
the bet.
clear, from your perspective, if the rule changes were, somehow or another illegal based on the constitutional powers that are given to the legislatures in each state to determine the rules for the election, right?
Mhm.
If those rule changes broke that process and were unauthorized, even if the votes themselves were legitimate, Biden lost the election. Is that right? Even if the people voted in good faith under the new rules, those new rules should never have been allowed to be put into place in the way that they were. Therefore, Biden lost the election. Is that your argument?
No.
Okay,
It could be the
because
case
that's
that
the
the
argument.
Supreme.
That's the argument that the Trump administration was making in court. You know, that was the whole thing hinged on that rule change when they went to court.
I think I would leave that to the Supreme Court. I think it is possible that you could have a scenario where they could say, okay, you change the rules you shouldn't have, but it didn't affect the election this time around. I mean, I would leave that to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I just think that my bet is that if you really examined in a forensic way all the votes, that you would find, you'd find some fraudulent votes in there. There always are, but the majority of the votes would be kosher, and that what you'd find is that Biden won. But you know what? The truth is, and this is being missed because of the debate about whether or not the election was rigged or not. The truth is, Biden won by a much, much, much smaller margin than anyone was saying he would beforehand, and than he ought to have from the liberal perspective. And the Democrats are much weaker than they want to let on. And I think that the problems in the country that led to the election of Trump are still in play, and the Democrats are not going to solve them. And so the real big picture political issues are not resolved by this question of, that rule change or whether or not, I mean, I just don't see any evidence for massive voter fraud.
Well,
I do think, the other thing is, if Georgia flipped to Trump would still have lost the election.
Well, but what you have to understand is the allegations are that this happened in all the swing states. I mean, and that's what, I was watching live till after midnight, and Trump had things well in hand when I went to bed. And in these 6 states, all of a sudden the counting stopped for a variety of excuses that they stopped the count. And then overnight, magically, Biden.
When
surpassed.
Back to George Bush.
And there were similar stories of shenanigans in the other places.
What always happens in elections is that you have the vote come in, and it really depends on where the vote's being counted as to what the results mean, right? So, like, I recall watching areas in 2000 where Gore was ahead, but it was being announced for Bush because the areas that still had to be counted were Republican strongholds. Right. And
but then when you get back to the Georgia video where you have all those votes that were dumped.
Well, we've already put that to bed. But here's the thing. When you have the mail-in votes come in, and so many more mail-in votes than normal because of the pandemic, and that would mean that the night of the election results have to be put in that same context as the votes for Gore were in 2000. The big Democratic strongholds, which is a vote by mail votes, were not yet fully counted that night. And look, Steve Bannon announced weeks ahead of time that they had a strategy for the election, which was to try to insist that the night of the election was what counted, and the mail-in ballots afterwards were illegitimate. And I read days and weeks before, or at least days before, that we should expect the vote count to take longer because of the mail-in ballots, and that the night of would probably lean towards Trump much more than the final result would. And you know what? It did, but not as much as people were expecting.
Yeah.
So anyway,
It's
we've been
tough. I
talking for
mean,
just about an hour, but I'll let you close out. I'll let you have the final word.
well, let's talk about, we've talked about the evidentiary standards. I mean, how hard it is to kind of filter out stuff that is illegitimate. The idea that we're sitting in front of our screen and we're just accepting what's being told to us versus the times when we know something's going on. Like I would suggest that that the censoring is really good evidence that we know that that's a problem. I mean, I've watched YouTube videos disappear in front of my eyes, So the fact that they're censoring is a legitimate reason to not believe anything that you're not seeing firsthand, unless you see it firsthand. So, having said that, I've seen a ton of evidence that there's all kinds of problems. Forensic audits where they adjudicate a vote, where a vote comes in and then it has to be manually adjudicated. The error rate's supposed to be like less than 1%, and they had a 68% in Michigan. They have affidavits that haven't been seen. And so all of this is something that I can't verify firsthand, but it is still.
Look, I'm with you when it comes to the way Twitter and Facebook and social media companies in general have been behaving politically. I think it's a huge problem. And I think that I recall the night of the election when Trump was speaking late into the night. And I was watching his non-concession speech on CNN. And he made some claims. I forget exactly what they were, but they were something along the lines of, "We've won. There's no statistical way that the Democrats can come back. We've absolutely won. It's statistically impossible that the Democrats could come back at this point. Why doesn't Biden concede?" Or something like that. And the CNN anchor broke in and refuted him before he had finished speaking. And I said, "Jesus, you cannot do that." Now I don't know everything that he said. I haven't heard all of Trump's argument, and you're stepping in. But the point is, I believe that their refutation was right, but nonetheless, they were tipping their hand. They wouldn't have done that to Biden. That was partisan, and it set up people like yourself, people who are not irrational, but on the right,
for sure,
to go, look, I can't trust anything these people say. They're not even letting the president speak. And you would have been right.
We haven't even talked about the issue of like the computers, where Trump, the president of the United States, he has access to the NSA. They're saying that they know they could see the packages going in and out of the elections. The voting machines were hooked up to and the idea that you can dismiss that kind of thing while silencing the president and assuming that this guy doesn't have that information.
Look, I just think that when you really have to separate out the bad behavior of the media from whether or not from the process of evaluating evidence. Just because one group, the media, is not giving you the full story doesn't mean that anything that comes along that goes against their narrative is true. Just like the cops aren't trustworthy. We've seen a lot of corruption with the cops, but that doesn't mean that every bit of evidence that comes from the cops has to be dismissed out of hand. And until you have really good evidence, it's the best evidence available. And I just would say, like, when it comes to the voting machines, the evidence I've seen was laughable about the voting machines being, because it was like tweets and
that's symptomatic of the difference of our silos. You're in Portland, very liberal. I'm in Indiana. The stuff I've seen is convincing, very convincing.
And that people right now who are like in my tribe are going to be judging me as being far too generous to you, right?
Yeah.
So
well, I appreciate you being brave enough to
I'm not saying I'm that brave. I just think that you got to be careful. It's like, take it step by step with these things. Yes, the media censorship is a problem, but luckily we do have a fairly transparent government, right? So like all the voting records are available. The laws that you can look into those laws, those are going to be accessible. They may not be available easily on Twitter, but you can look them up directly.
Well, I've seen a lot of evidence that stuff like that's been destroyed and that they're not available. People refusing subpoenas even for information. So and again, this is stuff that I can't really verify. And this is just what I'm hearing.
Well, see, I
have to take it with a grain of salt, and I do.
I mean, like, what are they subpoenaing, or what are they trying to get access to? What's being denied? All I know is that if you want to look at what the rules are and the rule change, that was a big point of contention in this conversation, that can be done. And if you want to investigate what the vote tallies were and when they came in, all of that information is online. And from the counties themselves, and that you don't have to go through the media to find out what the government itself is saying, because we have some transparency with our own government, which is much better than a lot of other states.
I think you're more trusting of the government than I am.
Yeah. Well, I'm not always, but I just know that we fought for transparency in our own government, that we don't always get it. But when we don't, things are redacted. You can tell what they're hiding. You don't know what they're exactly hiding, but you can tell generally when they are hiding things. And when it comes to elections, I think there's a lot of transparency in the reporting from these counties and districts. But the way that it gets spun into a narrative is that it's so dense, that information, it's such a big endeavor to figure out what's being told to you. Yeah. That, you would then rely on media companies, which may not be better at evaluating the evidence or spending any more time and energy than you would yourself, to evaluate those things.
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree. We can't trust the media, and the task to weigh the evidence is immense, but that doesn't mean that we get to just decide that the opposite of what the media tells us is true.
True. But what it means is it's an open question, really.
Well, yeah, I would say it's definitely still technically an open question, but I have yet to see good evidence that there was voter fraud in Georgia, and I have yet to see, and I am undecided as to the significance of that rule change, and I'll have to investigate it. And let's leave it there. But one more time, you apologize, right?
I apologize.
You're deluded.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I'm deluded.
Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.